Good day, everyone. We are Group 3 and we will be reporting the editorial cartoon. I am Faith Go and I will be reporting slides 1 to 10.
I am Marian Abecia and I'll be reporting slides 11 to 20.
To start, we have here our editorial cartoon. So, to enumerate a few of our observations, we've noticed that the editorial was published on September 24, 1937. And in the picture, we also see that there is a family of 10, and they only have one chicken and one pot to support them. In the text, it says, I have a wife and 8 children, and I earn only 1 peso daily. Must I have more children when I can hardly feed what I have? We've also noticed that the texts are in English, Cebuano, and in Spanish. Also, the house looks small for a family of 10 with 2 adults and 8 children. So here we have general information about the newspaper. The title, Dunay bukas nga klinika aron pagpugong sa panganak. And when we searched for the cartoonist, there wasn't really any source. So we looked into the publication. The editorial cartoon was published by Bag-ong Kusog or New Force. And based on the picture and the observations made by Group 3, we have assumed that the social issue is birth control. So Lopez Museum and Library. In the Facebook page of the Lopez Museum and Library, the same editorial cartoon was posted with the following caption. This Bagong Kusog editorial cartoon of September 24, 1937 still resonates in the present time. The birth control issue was advocated by the paper's publisher nationalist Vicente Soto. Struggling home after a day of toil, the emaciated worker makes a plea for birth control, a point reinforced by the Cebuano language caption asking for the opening of a birth control clinic. So more information about Bagong Kusog or New Force. Bagong Kusog was a periodical in Cebuano language that was in circulation before World War II. Established in 1915 in Cebu, Philippines, with its bilingual predecessor, Nueva Fuerza, it was published every Friday until it ceased operations at the outbreak of the war in 1941. Bagong Kusog started out as a Spanish Cebuano bi-weekly publication named Nueva Fuerza, and founded on May 2, 1915 by writer, editor, and politician Vicente Rama. Nueva Fuerza later became tri-weekly starting on February 7, 1919. Its printing press company, which was previously the Imprenta Rosario and the Imprenta The Cebu Chronicle, was sold to Vicente Rama. The company was then renamed the Cebu Press in 1917. Rama was assisted by circulation manager Felipe Tabasa and editors Julio Pangan and Eustaquio B. Gonzalez. In its heyday, Bagong Kusog was the leading periodical with a circulation of 7,000, considered high at that time. It was the most successful regional periodical, excluding the Manila printed issues by Liwayway Publications. It enjoyed popularity and wide readership in Cebuano-speaking provinces in Visayas and Mindanao, as well as immigrants in Hawaii. Its last issue was released in 1941 at the outbreak of World War II. Bagong Kusog and other local periodicals were considered a popular form of reading material in the pre-war era. They were inexpensive and contained information and appealed to the masses, newly accustomed to a free press. It contained coverage of current events, editorials, reports, columns, and literary works. Like the periodicals of its time, its role was assumed to be a vehicle for social change. One of the chief concerns of the writers of Bagong Kusog and the press was the changing attitude towards Spanish-era social customs and traditions, particularly among young people, that was attributed to the secularism brought by the American colonizers. Similar to the periodicals at that time, its contents may contain information that forward political interest. The press in general contributed greatly to the development of Cebuano literary arts in the decades leading up to the war. Writers published their works in newspapers and magazines due to the underdevelopment of the book publishing industry in Cebu, and Bagong Kusog printed literary outputs, publishing literary works such as novels, short stories, folklore, and poetry. Cebuano poets produced an estimated 13,000 poems before the war in various media. In addition, Bagong Kusog published Dr. Guardia Patra Gador Quijano's Lourdes, the first ever feminist novel written in the Cebuano language, with its advocacy for women to exercise their right to suffrage through serialized printing in its August to September 1939 issues. Additionally, it was also one of the crucial instruments in developing the art of Cebuano essay and journalism, as well as publishing the works of writers of short stories, which became popular in the early part of the 20th century. Bagong Kusog was a great Cebuano staple and a literary accomplishment that brought about press freedom. Having thousands of readers each day, the publication was a great vessel in bringing the issue of birth control into a new light, and it would have brought forth public and mass understanding and awareness of Planned Parenthood and the struggles of lower income class families. American rule in the Philippines. The Philippines were under American rule when the editorial cartoon was published in 1937. So, to give a little background, American settlement in the Philippines began during the Spanish colonial period. The period of American colonialization of the Philippines lasted 48 years, from cession of the Philippines to the U.S. by Spain in 1898 to U.S. recognition of Philippine independence in 1946. The United States invaded the Philippines, which was then governed by Spain as the Spanish East Indies, during the Spanish American War. After the conclusion of that war, Philippine revolutionaries declared independence as the revolutionary government of the Philippines. Wanting to maintain a stronghold over the island nation as a stepping stone to Japan and continental Asia, the United States maintained authority of the archipelago and the Philippine-American War ensued. America then held the Philippines until granting full independence on July 4, 1946. In economic terms, American colonial rule in the Philippines promoted an intensely dependent export economy based on cash crop agriculture and extractive industries like mining. American capital had initially regarded the Philippines as merely a stepping stone to the fabled China market, and American trade with the Philippine Islands that initially inhibited by reciprocity treaties and preserved Spanish trade rights. When these rights ended, U.S. capital divided politically over the question of free trade. American manufacturers supported free trade, hoping to secure in the Philippines both inexpensive raw materials and markets for finished goods, whereas sugar and tobacco producers opposed free trade because they feared Philippine competition. The Payne-Aldrich Tariff of 1909 established free trade with the exception of rice and set yearly quota limits for Philippine exports to the United States. American trade with the Philippine Islands, which had grown since the war, boomed after 1909, and during the decades that followed, the United States became by far the Philippines' dominant trading partner. American goods comprised only 7% of Philippine imports in 1899, but had grown to 66% by 1934. These goods include farm machinery, cigarettes, meat and dairy products, and cotton cloth. The Philippines sold 26% of its total exports to the United States in 1899 and 84% in 1934. Most of these exports were hemp, sugar, tobacco, and coconut products. Meanwhile, rural workers subject to the harsh terms of export-oriented development challenged the power of hacienda owners in popular mass movements. While some interested American companies did lobby against Philippine independence, during the Great Depression, powerful U.S. agricultural producers, especially of sugar and oils, supported U.S. separation from the Philippines as a protectionist measure to exclude competing Philippine goods. The Commonwealth period and formal Philippine independence would be characterized by rising tariffs and the exclusion of Philippine goods from the U.S. markets, upon which Philippine producers had come to depend. In the editorial cartoon, the father looks like he just came from the field. We can assume that the nature of his job would involve farming and crop production. Also, from our observations, the Filipino family looks like they belong to the low income class as indicated in the previous slides. During this period, the US was also suffering from the aftermath of the Great Depression, which lasted from 1929 to 1933. As the cartoon was published 4 years after the Great Depression ended, we could assume that the Philippine economy suffered indirectly as the US market also plummeted. This could also be one of the factors that contributed to the push of birth control in the Philippines, as low income families could hardly support themselves.
High birth rates help keep Filipinos in poverty. In an article published on Washington Post, Blaine Harden wrote, Maria Susana Espinosa wanted only 2 children, but it was not until after the birth of her fourth child in 6 years that she learned any details about birth control. I knew it existed, but I didn't know how it works, said Espinosa, who lives with her husband and children in a squatter's hut in a vast, stinking garbage dump by Manila Bay. She and her family belong to the fastest growing segment of the Philippine population, very poor people with large families. There are many reasons why this country is poor, including feudal patterns of land ownership and corrupt government. But there is a compelling link between family size and poverty. It increases in lockstep with the number of children as nutrition, health, education, and job prospects all decline, government statistics and many studies show. He also stated that birth and poverty rates here are among the highest in Asia, and the Philippines, where 4 out of 5 of the country's people are Roman Catholic, also stands out in Asia for its government's rejection of modern contraception as part of family planning. In 2008, public alarm in the Philippines over the soaring price of rice has focused attention on the fast growing population and its dependence on rice imports. Despite steadily increasing rice harvests, farmers here have been unable to keep pace with domestic demand. Economists here have calculated, though, that the Philippines would not need imported rice if it had managed to control population growth like its neighbor Thailand. According to Daniel F. Depper's research, he was able to conclude that wealthy and middle class Filipinos did not suffer greatly. Even the working class was partially protected because of a sugar boom and counter-cyclical construction employment. Most middle class employees kept their jobs and were favored by falling food prices. Therefore, the poor suffered greatly, especially in the 1930s, while the middle class and upper class did not experience the struggles of poverty at all. Birth control in the US in the 1920s to 1930s. To give a brief background on birth control in the US, so following the successful opening of the CRB in 1923, public discussion of contraception became more commonplace, and the term birth control became firmly established in the nation's vernacular. Of the hundreds of references to birth control in magazines and newspapers of the 1920s, more than two-thirds were favorable. The availability of contraception signaled the end of the stricter morality of the Victorian era and ushered in the emergence of a more sexually permissive society. Other factors that contributed to the new sexual norms included increased mobility brought by the automobile, anonymous urban lifestyles, and post war euphoria. By 1938, over 400 contraceptive manufacturers were in business. Over 600 brands of female contraceptives were available, and industry revenues exceeded $250 million per year. Condoms were sold in vending machines in some public restrooms, and men spent twice as much on condoms as on shaving. Although condoms had become commonplace in the 1930s, feminists in the movement felt that birth control should be the woman's prerogative, and they continued to push for development of a contraceptive that was under the woman's control, a campaign which ultimately led to the birth control pill decades later. Birth control in the Philippines in the 1930s, 20th century. So according to Dr. Jose Florante J. Leison, from 1581, the Spanish colonists suppressed women's rights, including the right to an abortion. Filipinos were considered second-class citizens until 1937, when a plebiscite on women's suffrage gave them the right to vote. For the first time, Filipinos could have some impact on decisions regarding their health. In the 1930s, abortion was controversial and performed in rural areas by quack doctors with improvised instruments and herbal concoctions. These crude gynecological procedures often led to serious complications, including death. After World War II, the American influence resulted in most abortions being performed by physicians. Massage abortion is a technology that has been described in Burma, Thailand, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Indonesia. The procedure is usually attempted when the woman is 12 to 20 weeks pregnant. She lies on her back with her knees drawn up, and the traditional birth attendant attempts to fix the uterus and then presses as hard as possible with her fingers the heel of her bare foot or even the wood pestle used to grind rice. During the 1930s, condoms were unavailable in Cebu. Condoms and other contraceptive products, such as birth pills, were made nationally available in the Philippines in the later part of the 20th century. In the 1930s, most couples made use of traditional birth control methods such as massage abortion, periodic abstinence or rhythm, withdrawal, and folkloric methods. The family planning program in the Philippines only began in 1971 and was considered one of the strongest in Asia. However, religious concerns, rapid decentralization, and various legal interventions have restricted implementation. Periodic abstinence, or the calendar method, has been widely used among Filipino couples. Earlier studies on family planning behavior have noted that even without any effort from the government to promote periodic abstinence as part of the family planning program, it was a popular method among Filipino couples. Alongside periodic abstinence, there was also high reliance on withdrawal as a family planning method. This stems from the fact that withdrawal does not entail cost and can be used spontaneously by couples. Withdrawal as a method also upholds the belief of men's power and reproductive decision making. Additionally, according to the news article from Bag-ong Kusog, which is the actual article attached below the editorial cartoon assigned to our group, it talked about a birth control clinic that was about to open in Manila during their time. It also talks about how both women and men from Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao would like to undergo birth control. With that, doctors in Cebu intended to open birth control clinics as well. Next is the modern methods for birth control in the Philippines. In 2012, the Responsible Parenthood and Reproductive Health Act was passed to help control pregnancy and birth and give women free choice regarding reproductive health enables people, especially the poor, to have the number of children they want and can feasibly care and provide for. The Responsible Parenthood and Reproductive Health Act of 2012, also known as the Reproductive Health Law or RH Law, and officially designated as Republic Act Number 10354, is a law in the Philippines which guarantees universal access to methods on contraception, fertility control, sexual education, and maternal care. While there is general agreement about its provisions on maternal and child health, there is great debate on its mandate that the Philippine government and the private sector will fund and undertake widespread distribution of family planning devices such as condoms, birth control pills, and IUDs as the government continues to disseminate information on their use through all healthcare centers. Currently, the Philippines have the following legal methods of Planned Parenthood. Modern methods include female sterilization, male sterilization, pill, IUD, injectable, condom, mucus billings or ovulation methods, standard days method, and lactational amenorrhea method. Traditional methods include calendar method, rhythm or periodic abstinence, and withdrawal. In more recent news, the Philippine Food and Drug in more recent news, the Philippine Food and Drug Administration has effectively lifted a Supreme Court order in 2015 temporarily banning 51 female hormonal contraceptive products by determining that they do not induce abortion. The FDA action meets a court condition that allowed for the automatic lifting of the ban after the FDA's recertification of those contraceptives. This will help address a significant shortfall in available types of birth control for Filipino women, particularly those with low incomes. The distribution ban forbade the sale of hormonal contraceptives, including drugs and devices, by drugstores and clinics. Despite this, only 41% of the poorest women use contraceptives, compared with 50% of the wealthiest. Most of this difference is due to lower use of sterilization among poor women. In 2017, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte had ordered government agencies to expand access to contraception, especially for poor women. By 2018, he instructs all poor households in the country should have zero unmet need for modern family planning. Birth control has long been available in the Philippines for middle class and wealthy women, but it is priced out of reach of the country's poor. Abortion is illegal, with no express exceptions. More than half of all pregnancies in the Philippines are unintended, according to the Guttmacher Institute, and more than 90% of unintended pregnancies occurred in the absence of modern contraceptive methods. Birth control is indeed still a prevalent issue in the Philippines. The issues presented in the editorial cartoon made in 1937 by the Bag-ong Kusog publication is still as present today as it was before. In the next slide, we have our references. And in the last slide, we have our group rating. That would be all. Thank you for listening.